September 30th, 1979. A muddy alleyway in a housing project on the outer edge of Rio de Janeiro. A man named Manuel Machado Rocha, 27 years old. He was a former Army infantryman and one of the finest marksmen in his old unit, but now he lay bleeding into the dirt. The neighborhood that adored him called him Mané Galinha. The world would later know him as Knockout Ned. He'd survived an earlier attempt on his life that year. He'd survived the assault that started his war. He'd survived a conflict that had turned children into executioners. But he wouldn't survive this. The bullets came from the gang of a man called Dino, who had finally tracked down his home address. The world would later know that man as Zé Pequeno. This wasn't just another favela killing. The man who died in that alley had become, against all odds, the moral center of an entire community. He was no innocent. He had a record. He carried a gun, and he ran an armed crew. But he was the one man who stood up to the king. And he didn't do it for territory, and he didn't do it for product. He did it for revenge, for what had been done to the woman he loved. The neighborhood loved him for that. They'd mourn him for years. And his death would mark the exact moment the Cidade de Deus stopped being a housing project and became something else entirely, a republic of guns. This is the story of how a government attempt to hide the poor of Rio de Janeiro behind a wall of distance and concrete created one of the most violent neighborhoods on earth. This is the story of how a boy named Paulo Lins walked out of that neighborhood alive, with a notebook full of dead men's names, and how he turned what he'd seen into a novel that became a film that shocked the world. This is the story of the real city of God. But here's what the movie didn't tell you. The real war was longer, dirtier, and far less stylish than the camera made it look. The real Zay Pequeno wasn't a cackling psychopath. He was something colder, more calculating. And the man who finally brought him down wasn't a rival kingpin in a cinematic shootout. It wasn't the police, either. It was time. It was the next generation of traffickers who seized his throne while he sat in a prison cell. To understand any of this, you have to go back to the beginning. In January of 1966, Rio de Janeiro drowned. Record rains turned the hillsides into avalanches. The favelas, those improvised brick and tin neighborhoods clinging to the slopes above Leblon, Lagoa, and Copacabana, slid into the sea. Around 250 people died. Tens of thousands lost their homes. And here's the part that gets simplified in most tellings. The hardline politician usually blamed for what came next. Carlos Lacerda, governor of the state of Guanabara, had already left office by the time the flood hit. But his machine was still running. For years, Lacerda had pushed a policy he called Hemocionismo removalism. The idea was brutally simple. You don't fix the favelas. You erase them. You truck the people somewhere else. The housing grid that would become Cidade de Deus had been planned under his government. But it was his successor, Governor Negro de Lima, who used the flood as the trigger. He loaded the newly homeless into army trucks and dumped them on the western edge of the city. That somewhere else was Jacarepa, GWHA. It was a swampy patch of absolutely nothing, 30 kilometers from the center, drained just enough to pour concrete on. They named it Cidade de Deus, City of God. The first families arrived in 1966, dropped off with whatever they could carry. They found rows of small concrete houses set on a grid. No paved streets, no buses, no schools, no clinic, and no police station. The marshlands still bled water through the foundations. Children walked to school through ankle-deep mud. Fathers commuted 4 hours a day for jobs in the city center and lost them when they showed up late one too many times. The state had created a perfect petri dish. Step 1. Concentrate the poorest people in Rio, the black families and the mixed-race families that the wealthy didn't want to see. Step 2. Strip out all the institutions. Step 3. Make sure no one in authority lives within 10 kilometers. Step 4. Walk away. What grows in soil like that grows wild. In 1965, a boy named Paulo Lins moved with his family to that unforgiving grid. His family was among the early arrivals. Born in Rio de Janeiro in 1958, he was the son of a house painter and a domestic worker who'd traveled down from the impoverished Northeast. Lins was small, he was black, and he liked to read. He had no idea he was being placed inside what would become 2 decades later one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in all of Rio. He just knew the streets weren't finished, and his new house smelled like wet cement. Lins grew up there through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. He went to school. He read poetry. He started writing it, along with writing sambas. But while he was doing that, the kids he'd played soccer with in the dirt were doing something else. They were graduating. From shoplifting to armed robbery. From armed robbery to holding up delivery trucks. From holding up trucks to selling marijuana out of corner houses. They called them BOHKs G-Fu Mo, mouths of smoke. The first generation of Cidade de Deus criminals were what Brazilians used to call malandros. They were street-smart hustlers with a code. They robbed gas stations. They held up motels. But they did not, as a strict rule, kill children. But by the early 1970s, that was already changing. And one of the people watching it change from the sidelines was Paulo Lins. Here's where the story turns. This is the history the movie compresses into a rapid 3-minute montage. You can't understand why CDG de Deus exploded the way it did without understanding the geography of Brazilian crime, because the true violence didn't start in that neighborhood. It started off the coast of Reee, on a prison island called Ilha Grande. During the military dictatorship that ran Brazil from 1964 to 1985, the generals made what they thought was a clever, calculated decision. They locked up their political enemies, communists, Marxist guerrillas, and student radicals, and they housed them at the Kahngdo Mendes Penitentiary, in the exact same wings as common criminals, robbers, thieves, and killers. The strategy was simple. Putting intellectuals next to thugs would humiliate the intellectuals. But the reality was the exact opposite. The thugs took notes. The leftist guerrillas were highly trained in cell structure, hierarchy, secure communication, and ideological discipline. The common criminals, sitting in the same cell block with them for years, absorbed every single lesson. Out of that unholy fusion in the late 1970s, a new name started to whisper its way through the Brazilian underworld. Comando Vermelho, the Red Command. It started as a prison gang for mutual protection. But by the time its founders started getting released or escaping in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it had mutated into something far more dangerous. It was a criminal franchise. A vast network with cells in every major favela in Rio, bound by a code of silence and a shared business model. And that business model was about to change forever, because cocaine was coming. Through the 1970s, the drug trade in Rio's favelas was almost entirely marijuana. It was a game of low margins and low violence. You sold a few bags, you made a few cruzeiros. Then, starting around 1980, Colombian cocaine began flooding into Brazil, through the Amazon and out of the port cities. The economics flipped overnight. A kilo of marijuana might net you a few $100s. A kilo of cocaine could net you 10,000. And the customers were no longer just the poor neighbors down the street. The new customers were the rich kids in Ipanema, the film producers in Leblon, and the lawyers in Bota Folk Go. Suddenly, a dusty bohk fu mo in a back alley of Cidade de Deus was the bottom rung of a multi-million-dollar pipeline that ran straight to Miami and Lisbon. That kind of astronomical money attracts a very different kind of person. In Cidade de Deus, that person was a skinny, dark-skinned kid named José Eduardo Hero Conceição. Born in 1957, the neighborhood called him Da Gino Little Baby. He hated the nickname. As he got older, and as he commanded more fear, he changed it. He started calling himself Zé Pequeno, Little Joe. He was small. He was quiet. He had a high-pitched laugh that sounded unsettling coming out of him. He'd been involved in crime since he was a child, and by the time he was 18, he was running with the older, hardened robbers. By his early 20s, he'd evolved into something nobody in the neighborhood had ever seen before, a businessman who killed for market share. The real Zé Pequeno wasn't a cackling movie villain. Friends and neighbors who survived those bloody years say the cold-blooded massacre the film pins on him was, in fact, someone else's doing. What Zé Pequeno actually was a master strategist. Around 1979, most of the bohkas, G, Fumo, and Cidade de Deus were independent operations. They were run by guys who'd grown up together. Zé Pequeno began to consolidate. The plan was ruthless and simple. There were maybe a dozen significant drug sales points in the favela. He wanted all of them. So he started killing the owners. Some he ambushed in the dark. Some he absorbed into his ranks. Some he simply walked up to and shot in the head right in front of their own families. Within roughly 24 months, by most accounts that survive today, Zé Pequeno controlled almost every bohka in the City of God. He had a total monopoly. He had soldiers. He had endless cash. He had, depending on which old residents you ask, somewhere between 50 and 200 armed teenagers working directly for him. And here's the dark truth that gets lost in the cinematic translation. He brought stability. Not the stability of peace, but the cold stability of absolute fear. Inside the favela, under Zé Pequeno's rule, you didn't get mugged. You didn't get robbed. You didn't get raped. If you did, and the perpetrator was found, that perpetrator was dragged away and executed in the alley behind the church. Residents who remember those years tell a deeply complicated truth. They were completely, utterly terrified of him. In 1979, Zé Pequeno went after a man named Mano Machado Rocha. Mano was born May 12, 1952. By 1979, he was 27 years old. His path wasn't a clean one. He drifted into crime young, pulling petty robberies and accumulating a string of arrests as a minor. It was the ordinary career of a favela kid with no other ladder to climb. At 18, he joined the Brazilian army and served a few years in an infantry battalion. There, he turned out to be one of the best shots in his entire unit. Then, he came home to Cidade de Deus. He was not an innocent. The accounts of what set off the war are documented across multiple sources, and they all converge on a single devastating spark. Sometime in 1979, Zé Pequeno's group seized and raped Manuel's girlfriend. That was the line that even the endless cocaine money couldn't paper over. It was a brutal humiliation aimed at a man the whole neighborhood revered. And Mano Machado Rocha did something nobody in Cidade de Deus had ever dared do to Zé Pequeno. He picked up a gun and went looking for the king. This is the part the movie got exactly right. Man WL had military training. He knew how to shoot. He knew how to move. He struck first at Zé Pequeno's gang, violently killing 2 of his men in the opening raid. Then he turned on his soldiers, then on anyone who sold for him. Within months, the neighborhood split in half. There was Zé Pequeno's army, and there was Mano's army, an army he rapidly expanded, and armed with heavier weapons than the other side carried. And caught in the middle were tens of thousands of trapped residents, just trying to keep their kids alive. Cidade de Deus is laid out on a grid, but by then the grid had been completely overgrown. The original concrete row houses had been added onto, expanded, and stacked into the sky. The wide spaces between blocks had been filled in with brick. The result was a claustrophobic labyrinth of narrow alleys, BEHCos, just wide enough for two people to pass each other. Inside that labyrinth, two armies fought a brutal guerrilla war. The economics were vicious and simple. A BOH Kaji Fumo in 1980 was generating, by the most credible estimates that survive in academic accounts, between $5,000 and $20,000 a week in pure profit. There were dozens of them across the favela. Whoever controlled the most BOHKs controlled the most money. Whoever controlled the most money could buy the most guns. The arithmetic of the war meant nobody could stop. To stop was to die. Teenagers who hadn't even finished the 4th grade were suddenly carrying weapons of war. Weapons paid for by the cocaine appetite of the exact same Rio elite who decades earlier had voted to push them out to the swamp. And in the middle of this escalating nightmare was a researcher named AHL Bazalu AR. She was a Brazilian anthropologist who, in the early 1980s, came to see Cidade de Deus. She was there to do the doctoral fieldwork that would anchor her study of how urban poverty curdles into organized criminal warfare. She needed a local assistant. She needed someone the community would trust. Someone who could move between the BOHKs, the church, and the schools without getting shot. She found a young poet who'd grown up in the neighborhood and was now studying literature at the Federal University. His name was Paulo Lins. Lins started working for Zalu AR in the mid-1980s. His job was to collect testimonies. He carried a notebook. He interviewed former bandidos, current bandidos, mothers of dead bandidos, sisters of dead bandidos, priests, teachers, and cops. He went to funerals. He went back to the exact same dirt alleys he'd played soccer in as a child. And he asked the men who controlled them now how the business actually worked. He asked how a kilo got cut, how a soldier got recruited, how a BOHK got taken, how a hit got ordered, how a body got buried. What he discovered, slowly, was that the war he was documenting wasn't just a series of random, chaotic gunfights. It was a system. It had rules. It had ranks. It had economics that could be charted on a piece of paper. The Comando Vermelho had given the favela traffickers a model, and the cocaine boom had given them the endless money to scale it. The state had given them an empty neighborhood with no police and no oversight, and the traffickers had filled that empty space with their own government, a government that taxed, that ruled, and that killed. Manuel Machado, Mané Galinha, was killed on September 30th, 1979. He'd been attacked earlier in the year and survived. The second time, he didn't. Most accounts agree that Pequeno and his gang finally discovered where he lived. They gunned him down at his home, right in front of his parents and his younger siblings. He was 27 years old. The neighborhood turned out for his funeral in numbers the police couldn't believe. He'd become, in the bloody months of his war against Pequeno, something more than just a man. He had become proof that you could fight back. The fact that he died doing it didn't diminish that legend. In some ways, it amplified it. In early 1980, leadership of the resistance passed to a trafficker named Ieel Ton Bata. The movie's character, Say No Ra, never actually existed as a single real man. He was a composite, loosely modeled on Bata. The war dragged on into the early 1980s. Weekly killings, houses burned to the ground, mothers wailing over bodies left in the dirt. An entire generation of children grew up utterly convinced that the crack of gunfire was simply the natural sound of the evening. The state finally noticed, not because it cared, But because the bodies were starting to make the newspapers down in the wealthy South Zone, operations began. Police incursions into Cidade de Deus became regular occurrences. But they were not, by any honest account, peacekeeping operations. They were brutal retaliations. Cops who'd been embarrassed by the favela war wanted blood. Then came 1985. In the exact same year, the military dictatorship in Brazil finally collapsed. José Eduardo Barreto Conceição Zé Pequeno died. Here is where the script the movie wrote diverges hardest from reality. He'd been arrested. He'd managed to escape from the Frei Kaneshka prison, and he came back to Cidade de Deus to violently retake the BOHKs he'd lost. But a new generation of traffickers had taken over in his absence, and they weren't about to hand the empire back. Accounts of exactly how he died differ. Some say the rival faction shot him. Some say his body carried no wounds at all, pointing to an overdose, with his own associates unceremoniously hauling his corpse out of the favela. But what they all agree on is the bitter irony. The man who'd killed his way to a monopoly was finished off not by the police and not by Mané Galinha. He was finished by the next wave of younger killers he himself had helped create. He'd ruled the city of God for roughly 6 years. He'd killed, by the lowest credible estimates, dozens of people personally, and he'd ordered the deaths of dozens more. He'd built a cocaine empire out of the cinder block houses of a deliberately forgotten housing project, and at the end, he died young, exactly the way almost every favela kingpin since has died. His death didn't end the trade. It just opened a vacancy. The Comando Vermelho moved in fully. By the late 1980s, Cidade de Deus was a confirmed CV stronghold. Where Zé Pequeno had run a brutal personal kingdom, the Red Command now ran a highly organized corporate franchise. The killing continued. The cocaine continued. The teenagers with rifles continued. And in 1986, Paulo Lins started writing. Here's the part that almost nobody outside Brazil knows. The book Cidade de Deus wasn't written in a year. It wasn't written in 2 years. It was written across 8 grueling years. While Lins worked other jobs, while he raised a family, while he kept going back to the favela to verify what he'd been told. He had thousands of pages of interview transcripts from his work with AHL Bazalu AR. He had his own memories. He had the names of the dead memorized. He wrote in a style nobody had used before in Brazilian literature. He wrote the way people in Cidade de Deus actually talked. He wrote without sentimentality. He wrote roughly 300 named characters into one single book, most of them based on real people, and most of them dead by the time the book was finished. Cidade de Deus, the novel, was published in 1997 by Companhia das Letras, the most prestigious literary publisher in Brazil. It ran more than 500 pages. Critics didn't know what to do with it at first. It was too violent for a literary novel. It was too literary for a crime novel. It was too true for either. Then, the reviews started coming in. The critic Roberto Schwarz, one of the most respected literary minds in Latin America, championed it. The book won awards. It sold. And it did something almost no Brazilian novel had ever done. It made the Brazilian middle class look at the favelas without flinching. A filmmaker named Fernando Meirelles read the book. He saw the movie immediately. He partnered with the screenwriter Braulio Mantovani and the co-director Kahtia Lund. They made a decision that would define the project forever. They wouldn't use professional actors. They would cast the kids from the favelas. They ran a sprawling casting and acting workshop, drawing on the NOHS do MOHO theater group We From the Hill that had been founded in the Vidigal favela back in 1986. They auditioned hundreds of teenagers from communities like VGWL and Cidade de Deus itself. The actor they eventually cast as Zé Pequeno, Le Alejandro Fear Me No, was a young man from Cidade de Deus who by his own account only went to the audition to keep his friend company. The film Cidade de Deus was released in 2002. It went on to earn 4 Academy Award nominations for directing, adapted screenplay, cinematography, and editing. It's now routinely listed among the greatest films of the 21st century, and for the residents of the real Cidade de Deus, it was a mixed blessing of historic proportions. On one hand, the movie forced Brazil and the world to acknowledge that the favelas weren't picturesque slums, but war zones with complex histories. NGOs arrived. Foreign journalists arrived. Social programs that had been ignored for 40 years suddenly received funding. The actors who'd been cast became brief celebrities. Some of them used the money to leave the favela. Some used it to stay and build schools. On the other hand, the movie did something the residents have spent more than 20 years trying to undo. It stamped a permanent brand on the neighborhood. After 2002, putting Cidade de Deus on your resume in Rio meant your resume went straight in the trash. Employers in the South Zone associated the address with the killers on the screen. The tens of thousands of residents of the real Cidade de Deus, the great majority of whom had never held a gun, found themselves represented globally by Lay Ahn Dro Fear Meeno's high-pitched laugh. In 2009, in preparation for the World Cup and the Olympics, the state government installed a pacifying police unit, a UPP, in Cidade de Deus. The murder rate dropped. The Comando Vermelho went underground. Schools reopened. Then the Olympics ended. The funding ended. The UPP program collapsed across Rio. By the end of the 2010s, the traffickers were back. The rifles were back. The alleys were dangerous again. Today, in the 2020s, Cidade de Deus is fiercely contested ground between drug factions and the malicious paramilitary mafias run by former and current police officers. Paulo Lins is still alive. He's still writing. He's a poet, a screenwriter, a teacher. He survived the neighborhood. Most of the men he interviewed did not. Most of the men whose names fill his novel did not. He said in interviews that he wrote the book because nobody else was going to. Because if he didn't write down what happened, the names of the dead would disappear, and the architecture of violence that killed them would be rebuilt somewhere else, by people who never learned what had already failed. That is the real story of Cidade de Deus. It isn't about cool kids running through alleys with revolvers. It's about a government that tried to make poverty invisible. It's about a generation of children who were given a swamp and told to build a city. It's about a man named Manuel No Saint, but no monster either, who picked up a gun because the woman he loved was attacked, and a quiet boy named Dajinho, who picked up a gun because he wanted to rule the world, and both of them dying before they turned 30. It's about a researcher with a notebook who walked the same alleys they did and lived to write it down. Pequeno ruled the city of God for roughly 6 years. He died at 28, killed by the same kind of young gunman he'd built his kingdom on. He left no fortune. He left no children who carry his name in public. He left a body count that no historian has ever been able to fully calculate, and a neighborhood that has spent 4 decades trying to recover. Mané Galinha lived 27 years. He left a fiancée he couldn't protect, a brother buried not long after him, and a legend the favela has not let die. Paulo Lins took what they did and what was done to them and put it on the page. That page became a film, and that film became the way the world thinks about Brazilian poverty. Cidade de Deus today is still contested. The kids running through the alleys today carry weapons their grandparents couldn't have even imagined. The real story of City of God is not a story about gangsters. It's a story about what happens when a state decides certain citizens don't deserve to be seen. The cocaine, the wars, the kingpins, the funerals, all of it grew out of that single, catastrophic decision in 1966. Move them, hide them, forget them. The men with the guns just filled the empty space. If you found this story compelling, hit subscribe. We drop a new deep dive every week into the real history behind the films and the headlines. Drop a comment below. What other crime story do you want us to unpack?